Pull your chair closer to the fire, friend, 'cause tonight I've got a tale that'll warm your bones better than any whiskey ever could. It's a story about love that grows slow and sure, like wildflowers pushing through cracked earth. About how sometimes the best things in life ain't the ones we plan for, they're the ones that find us when we least expect them. This here is the story of two souls who thought their hearts had gone cold as winter ground, and how a little frontier town called Sagebrush Cross taught them that even the hardest winters give way to spring. It's about marriage and partnership, about what it means to build something together when you start with nothing but need and hope. And if you think you know how love stories go, well, this one might surprise you, because sometimes the greatest romance ain't written in passion and fire. It's written in quiet mornings and shared burdens, in the steady rhythm of two people choosing each other day after day, even when the choosing ain't easy. The train that brought Maribel Emerson to Sagebrush Cross, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1883 was 3 hours late, covered in dust, and running on prayers and determination. Not unlike Maribel herself, if truth be told. She stepped down onto the wooden platform with everything she owned in a battered carpet bag and a leather satchel full of books. At 28, she was past the age when most women considered themselves prime marriage material, with brown hair that refused to stay properly pinned and hands that bore the calluses of hard work rather than the softness of leisure. But Maribel had something more valuable than beauty or youth. She had learning, real education, the kind that came from years of teaching in Chicago schools before the fever took her husband and left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. Sagebrush Cross wasn't much to look at. A main street that could be walked end to end in 5 minutes, maybe 10 if you stopped to pet every dog along the way. The buildings leaned against each other like tired friends, and the wind carried the perpetual scent of dust and possibility. The man waiting for her at the station was Daniel Thatcher, and he looked exactly like what he was, a blacksmith who'd spent 15 years shaping iron and being shaped by it in return. Broad shoulders, hands scarred by sparks and calloused by hammer work, with brown hair going gray at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky. They'd corresponded for 3 months through carefully worded letters arranged by the Territorial Settlement Office. A marriage of convenience, they called it. Nothing romantic about it, just two practical people solving practical problems. Mrs. Emerson. Daniel's voice was deep, careful.
Mr. Thatcher.
She nodded, suddenly aware of how small she felt next to him.
Welcome to Sagebrush Cross. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. Not at all, though I admit the scenery is different from Chicago. Daniel almost smiled at that. Difference, one word for it. Come on, I'll show you to the house. My daughter's waiting to meet you. They walked through town in companionable silence, Maribel taking in the sights, the mercantile with its optimistic display of goods, the saloon that looked respectable enough for a frontier establishment, the church with its modest steeple pointing toward endless sky. And everywhere, the people, hard-working folks with sun-weathered faces and the kind of steady gazes that came from making do with less and being grateful for it. They nodded politely as Daniel and Maribel passed, but she could feel their curiosity like a physical weight. They're wondering about you, Daniel said, reading her thoughts. About us. Most folks here knew my first wife, Rebecca. She was born here, part of the community since birth. And I'm the stranger from back east who's come to take her place. Daniel stopped walking and looked at her directly. You're not taking anyone's place, Mrs. Emerson. You're making your own place. There's a difference. Something in his voice, a gentleness she hadn't expected, made her look at him more carefully. Behind the weathered exterior, she caught a glimpse of a man who understood what it meant to start over, to build something new from the ashes of what came before. The Thatcher house sat at the end of a quiet street, modest but well-maintained. A front porch with a swing, windows with real glass, and a garden that showed signs of careful tending despite the approaching winter. Rebecca loved her flowers, Daniel said, following her gaze. Scarlett's been trying to keep them alive, but she's only 11, and And flowers need a woman's touch, Maribel finished gently. I'd be happy to help come spring. Before Daniel could respond, the front door burst open and a whirlwind of red hair and freckles came flying down the porch steps. Papa, is this her? Is this my new mama? Scarlet Thatcher was everything her name implied, bright, fierce, and impossible to ignore. She had her father's gray eyes, but none of his reserve, studying Maribel with the frank curiosity of childhood. This is Mrs. Emerson, Daniel said carefully. She's come to help us. Maribel knelt down to Scarlet's level. Hello, Scarlet. I've heard so much about you in your father's letters. He tells me you're quite the scholar. I can read better than anyone in town except for Reverend Matthews, and he's got all those fancy books. Papa says you're going to teach me more things. Is that true? If you'd like me to, yes. I brought some books with me that I think you might enjoy. Scarlet's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Real books? New ones I haven't read? Brand new to you. Stories about faraway places and brave people doing remarkable things. For the first time since stepping off that dusty train, Maribel felt something loosen in her chest. Whatever else happened in this arranged marriage, at least she could give this bright, eager child the gift of learning. The inside of the house was clean but sparse with the unmistakable feeling of a place where men had been living alone too long. Not dirty, but lacking the small touches that made a house feel like home. No curtains on the windows, no flowers on the table, none of the gentle refinements that women brought to domestic spaces. I know it's not what you're used to, Daniel said, a note of apology in his voice. It's perfect, Maribel replied, and meant it. After months of living in Chicago boarding houses, any place she could call her own felt like a palace. When that is, when would you like to have the ceremony? Daniel cleared his throat. Suddenly awkward. I thought perhaps tomorrow morning, if that suits you. Reverend Matthews can perform the service. Nothing fancy, just practical. Practical, Maribel agreed. That sounds fine. But that evening, as she sat on the front porch swing watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Maribel wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Not about coming west that had been necessity, pure and simple, but about believing she could make a life with a man she barely knew, in a place that would never truly accept her as one of their own. Scarlet came out and sat beside her, chattering about her friends and her schoolwork and all the things she wanted to learn. And gradually, listening to the child's bright voice mixing with the evening sounds of settling horses and distant conversation, Maribel began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Maybe this arrangement would work out after all. Maybe practical was enough. Maybe two people who needed what the other could provide might find something resembling happiness in the trying. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows and the smell of winter riding the wind. Maribel, dressed in her best dress, a simple blue wool that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. No white gown, no flowers, no celebration, just a practical ceremony for a practical arrangement. Reverend Matthews performed the service in his small church with Daniel, Scarlet, and two witnesses from town in attendance. The words were familiar, traditional, but they felt strange in her mouth when applied to this quiet man beside her whom she was only just beginning to know. Do you, Maribel, take Daniel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? She looked at Daniel's serious face, at his steady gray eyes, at the hands that could shape iron, and she was beginning to suspect might be gentle enough to shape hearts as well. I do. Do you, Daniel, take Maribel to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Daniel's voice was quiet but certain. I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. And just like that, Maribel Emerson became Maribel Thatcher. wife to a man she'd known for less than 24 hours, stepmother to a child who was already more real to her than most of the adults she'd known back in Chicago. After the ceremony, the small wedding party walked to the schoolhouse, a one-room building that had been closed since the previous teacher left to get married. Maribel had been hired to reopen it, to bring learning back to the children of Sagebrush Cross. She stood in the doorway looking at the empty desks, the dusty chalkboard, the potential waiting to be fulfilled. This would be her domain, her contribution to the community and to her new family. It needs work, Daniel said, coming up behind her. Everything worthwhile needs work, Maribel replied. The question is whether we're willing to do it. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if he was thinking about more than just the schoolhouse.
Yes, he said finally. I believe we are.
That night, in a small bedroom that would be hers, Daniel had insisted she take the main bedroom while he moved to a smaller room at the back of the house. Maribel unpacked her few belongings and tried to make sense of her new life. She was married to a stranger. She was responsible for a child who wasn't hers. She was expected to teach the children of people who weren't sure they trusted her. And winter was coming to a place where winter could kill you if you weren't prepared. But as she listened to the quiet sounds of her new family settling in for the night, Daniel banking the fire, Scarlett humming herself to sleep, Maribel felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The first month of marriage passed quietly, with all three Thatchers learning the careful dance of becoming a family. Maribel threw herself into reopening the school, cleaning and organizing, writing to educational supply companies back east, and preparing lessons for students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Daniel continued his work at the forge, the steady ring of hammer on anvil marking the rhythm of days. But now he came home to a house that smelled of fresh bread and learning, where curtains graced the windows and books lay open on tables, where his daughter's laughter rang out more often than it had since her mother died. And slowly, carefully, two adults who had married for practical reasons began to discover each other. Maribel learned that Daniel read poetry in the evenings, books of Longfellow and Whitman hidden among his practical manuals on metalworking and farming, that he had built Scarlett's bed himself, carving small flowers into the headboard because he remembered how much his first wife had loved her garden, that he worried constantly about doing right by his daughter, about being enough for a child who needed more than just a roof and regular meals. Daniel learned that Maribel had lost her own child, a son who lived only 3 days, and that teaching other people's children was both a joy and a constant reminder of what she'd lost. That she hummed while she worked, usually hymns her grandmother had taught her back in Ohio. That she read voraciously anything she could get her hands on as if books were food and she'd been starving. They were polite with each other, respectful, gradually warming from strangers to something approaching friends. But there was still a careful distance between them, an awareness that this marriage was built on need rather than love, that neither wanted to presume too much or expect too much from the other. The school opened in November, with 14 students ranging from Scarlett and her friend Emmy to the Morrison twins, who were nearly grown but had never learned their letters properly. Maribel threw herself into teaching with the passion of someone who had found her true calling. She organized spelling bees and geography contests, started a small lending library with her own books, and began planning a Christmas pageant that would showcase what the children had learned. The townspeople, initially skeptical of the outsider teacher, began to warm to her as they saw their children's excitement about learning. December brought the first real snow, and with it a test none of them had expected. The blizzard struck on a Tuesday morning, sweeping down from the mountains with the fury of nature unleashed. By noon, snow was falling so thick you couldn't see the next building over, and the wind howled like all the wolves of the world had gathered to sing. Maribel had dismissed school early, making sure every child made it safely home before the worst of the storm hit. She and Scarlett were in the kitchen baking bread and watching the snow pile higher and higher against the windows when they heard the banging on the door. Daniel answered, stamping snow off his boots and shaking his head grimly. There's a man out there, he said, collapsed near the schoolhouse, half frozen and burning with fever. Tom Bradley and I carried him to the school. It was closer than trying to get him here. Is he alive? Maribel asked, already reaching for her shawl. Barely. Maribel, you can't. The man might have anything. Consumption, typhoid, God knows what else. But Maribel was already wrapping herself against the cold. He's a human being, Daniel. We can't just leave him to die. Mama Maribel's right, Papa, Scarlett said, using the name she'd begun calling her stepmother. Remember what Reverend Matthews preaches about the Good Samaritan. Daniel looked at his wife and daughter, saw the determination in both their faces, and sighed. All right, but we do this careful like, and if the man shows signs of something catching, we'll deal with that when we come to it, Maribel said firmly. They bundled up and fought their way through the storm to the schoolhouse where Tom Bradley and his son were trying to get a fire going while the mysterious stranger lay unconscious on a makeshift bed of coats and blankets. The man was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and the kind of pale, thin look that spoke of recent illness or hard traveling. His breathing was shallow, labored, and when Maribel touched his forehead, she could feel the fever burning through him. He needs nursing, she said simply. Medicine, if we can manage it, but mostly just care, someone to watch over him, keep him warm, get water into him when he can take it. Maribel, Daniel said quietly, the risk, I know the risk, but I also know what happens to people when we turn our backs on them. She looked at him steadily. This is who I am, Daniel. This is what I do. If you married me thinking I was someone who could walk away from suffering, then you married the wrong woman. For a long moment, Daniel just looked at her. Then something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition, or maybe just respect. All right, he said, then we'd better get organized. Tom, can you fetch Doc Patterson? And we'll need supplies, blankets, medicine, food for anyone who's helping. What followed were 3 days and nights that tested the small community of Sagebrush Cross in ways they'd never expected. The stranger who mumbled something about his name being Jack when he was lucid enough to speak burned with fever that wouldn't break. Half the town wanted to turn him out, afraid of contagion. The other half, led by Maribel's quiet example, insisted on caring for him. They took shifts sitting with the sick man. Maribel, Daniel, Doc Patterson, Reverend Matthews, and several others, including Emma Morrison and her grown daughters. The schoolhouse became a makeshift hospital with people coming and going despite the continuing storm, bringing soup and blankets and whatever help they could offer. But it was Maribel who stayed the longest, who seemed to know instinctively what the sick man needed. She bathed his fever-hot skin with cool water, coaxed medicine down his throat drop by drop, and talked to him in a low, soothing voice even when he couldn't respond. Daniel watched her work, saw the gentle competence with which she handled the crisis, the way she never seemed to doubt that doing the right thing was worth the risk. And somewhere in those long, worried days, something changed in how he saw his practical wife. On the third night, the fever finally broke. Jack woke up weak but coherent, able to tell them he was a traveling minister who'd been caught in a storm while trying to reach the next town over. He'd been fighting pneumonia for weeks, he said, but hadn't wanted to impose on strangers. You already did impose, Doc Patterson told him gruffly. Lucky for you, we've got folks in this town who don't mind being imposed on by those who need help. A man's eyes found Maribel, who was sitting nearby with mending in her lap. You're the one who stayed with me, aren't you? I remember your voice. We all stayed with you, Maribel said quietly. That's what neighbors do. But Daniel knew better. Yes, others had helped, but it was Maribel who had refused to give up. Maribel, whose determination had held the community together when fear might have driven them apart. The storm finally ended, but its effects lingered. The weight of snow had damaged the town's grain mill, breaking crucial gears that would take weeks to repair or replace, with winter only half over and their primary source of ground grain out of commission. The people of Sagebrush Cross faced a crisis that had nothing to do with mysterious strangers and everything to do with survival. We've got grain, Tom Bradley said at the emergency town meeting, but without the mill we can't process it. and the nearest working mill is a 2-day ride in good weather. What about rationing what we have? Someone suggested. Won't be enough, Doc Patterson said bluntly. Not to last until spring, not with the amount of processed grain we have on hand. The mood in the room grew tense. These were people who had survived droughts, harsh winters, and economic downturns. But the prospect of hunger, real hunger, was frightening in a way that mere hardship was not. What if we fixed the mill ourselves? Maribel asked quietly. The room turned to look at her. Ma'am? Tom Bradley prompted. The mill. What if we repaired it ourselves instead of waiting for parts to come from back east or trying to haul grain to distant mills? It's not that simple, Bradley said. The gears that broke, they're specialized. You need a foundry, special tools. You need a blacksmith, Daniel said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. A good blacksmith with the right equipment could cast new gears. It would take time and I'd need help, but it could be done, Reverend Matthews asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. Maybe I'd need to study the broken parts, figure out the specifications. And I'd need help more than just one man could manage. It would mean practically the whole town working together. Then that's what we'll do, Maribel said simply. We'll work together. What followed was a month that would be remembered in Sagebrush Cross long after the people who lived it were gone. The entire community rallied around the mill repair project with the kind of determination that built the West in the first place. Daniel's forge became the heart of the operation. Men who had never done more than shoe their own horses found themselves learning to work metal under his patient instruction. Women organized food and supplies for the workers, kept the children occupied and educated, and managed the 100 details that such a project required. Maribel found herself in the center of it all, not because she sought leadership, but because people naturally turned to her when problems arose. Her school teacher's organizational skills, her calm manner in crisis, and her ability to see solutions where others saw only obstacles made her invaluable. More than that, though, was the way she treated everyone, longtime residents and newcomers alike, as if they were all equally important, equally capable of contributing something vital to the effort. In a community that had sometimes struggled with divisions between the established families and newer arrivals, Maribel's inclusive leadership helped heal old wounds. Daniel watched his wife work, saw how she encouraged Tom Bradley's shy teenage son to speak up with good ideas, how she found ways for elderly Mrs. Henshaw to contribute despite her arthritis, how she somehow managed to keep everyone focused on their common goal instead of their individual grievances. And slowly, as they worked side by side in the forge, Maribel learning to operate the bellows, Daniel teaching her the basics of metalwork, their careful, respectful marriage began to transform into something deeper. It started with small things. Daniel bringing Maribel coffee without being asked when she was working late on mill plans. Maribel mending Daniel's work shirts with special care, adding small decorative touches that weren't necessary but showed she was thinking of him. Comfortable silences that didn't need to be filled with conversation. Shared glances when Scarlett said something particularly clever or funny. You're different than I expected, Daniel told her one evening as they sat by the fire, both exhausted from another long day at the forge. Different how? Stronger, more, I don't know, more everything, I suppose. When I wrote those letters, I thought I was looking for someone to keep house and help with Scarlett. Someone quiet and grateful and willing to stay in the background. Maribel looked up from the sock she was darning, and instead you got someone who drags 6 strangers into schoolhouses and organizes the whole town to rebuild mill gears. Yes, Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made her meet his eyes. Instead, I got someone who makes me remember why I wanted to build a life here in the first place. Someone who makes me want to be better than I am. Before Maribel could respond, Scarlett appeared in the doorway in her nightgown. Papa? Mama? Maribel? I had a bad dream. Come here, sweetheart, Maribel said, opening her arms. Scarlett climbed onto her stepmother's lap, and Daniel watched as Maribel held the child, stroking her red hair and humming softly until the little girl's breathing deepened into sleep. "She loves you," he said quietly. "I love her too, more than I expected when I agreed to this arrangement." "And what about me?" The question was out before Daniel could stop it, vulnerable in a way that his practical letters had never been. Maribel looked at him over Scarlett's sleeping head, her expression soft in the firelight. "What about you, Daniel Thatcher? Are you asking if I love you too?" "I suppose I am." She was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel held his breath, suddenly afraid he'd presumed too much, pushed too hard, too fast. "I married you because I needed security and you needed help with Scarlett," she said finally. "That was the arrangement, and it was honest as far as it went. But these past months, watching you with your daughter, seeing how you treat people, working beside you on this mill project, I've learned that need and love aren't as different as I thought they were. Meaning I needed you before I knew you. And now that I know you, I find that need has grown into something much deeper, something that looks an awful lot like love." Daniel set down his book and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. "Maribel Thatcher," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of marrying me? Not for practical reasons this time, but because I love you and want to spend my life with you and our daughter." She laughed softly, careful not to wake Scarlett. "Daniel Thatcher, I believe I already did marry you, but if you're asking whether I'd like to renew those vows with different intentions behind them, then yes. I would be honored to marry you again for love this time." The mill project was completed in early March, just as the first signs of spring began to show in longer days and the occasional warm afternoon. The new gears worked perfectly, grinding grain as smoothly as the original equipment had. The town celebrated with a feast that lasted 2 days, with music and dancing and speeches about cooperation and community spirit. But for the Thatcher family, the real celebration was quieter and more personal. On a morning in late March, with the sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold and the first wildflowers beginning to push through the thawed ground, Daniel and Maribel stood together on their front porch, watching Scarlett play in the yard. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. "About which part? Coming west, marrying a stranger, helping to rebuild a mill, or falling in love with both my husband and my stepdaughter?" "Any of it, all of it." Maribel leaned into his embrace, marveling at how right it felt, how natural. 6 months ago, she'd been alone in Chicago with no prospects and no hope. Now she had a family, a community, a purpose, and a love that had grown from practical necessity into something as solid and enduring as the mountains that surrounded their valley. "No regrets," she said firmly, "though I have to admit this isn't how I imagined my life would turn out."
Better or worse than you imagine?
She considered that, thinking about her first marriage, passionate and impulsive, built on romance, but not on the kind of deep compatibility that made daily life work. Thinking about the loneliness and desperation that had driven her west to marry a stranger. Thinking about the careful, respectful courtship that had grown into lasting love right here in their own home. "Different," she said finally. "Better than I dared to hope, different from what I thought I wanted, but exactly what I needed." Scarlett came running up to them, her red hair flying and her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mama Maribel, Papa, look what I found." She held up a handful of tiny wildflowers, the first of the season, brave little blooms that had pushed their way through the last patches of snow. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Maribel said, accepting the flowers with appropriate ceremony. Just like spring itself, they had to wait through the whole winter, but they knew their time would come. Daniel looked at his wife and daughter, at the flowers that symbolized new beginnings, at the town beyond their yard where people were starting their daily work with the contentment of a community that had weathered crisis together. "Speaking of spring," he said, "I was thinking it might be time to expand that garden, maybe add some vegetable plots, plant some fruit trees." "That sounds wonderful," Maribel agreed. "Scarlett, would you like to help us plant a garden?" "Can we plant flowers too? Lots and lots of flowers, all different colors." As many as you want, Daniel promised. After all, a garden's not complete without flowers. Later that evening, after Scarlett had gone to bed and the dishes were done, Daniel and Maribel sat on their front porch swing watching the stars come out in the clear frontier sky. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Daniel said, about need and love not being as different as you thought. What about it? I think maybe that's the secret, not just to our marriage, but to building anything that lasts. Starting with what you need, doing the work even when it's hard, and discovering that the doing creates something bigger than what you started with. Maribel nodded thoughtfully. Like the mill project, we started because we needed grain, but we ended up with something more important, proof that we could work together, that we could solve problems as a community. Exactly. And like us, we started with practical needs, but we built something stronger by showing up for each other day after day, even when it wasn't easy, Maribel added, especially when it wasn't easy. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their small town, thinking about the journey that had brought them together and the future they would build together. Daniel, Maribel said eventually. Eventually, yes. Thank you. For what? For writing those letters. For taking a chance on a stranger. For letting me become part of your family. For showing me that love doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it just grows quietly in the space between two people who choose to keep showing up for each other. Daniel lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. Thank you for answering those letters. For coming west to marry a man you'd never met. For loving my daughter as your own. For teaching me that a practical marriage can become the most impractical, wonderful love story of all. Now, friend, as the fire burns down to embers and the night grows quiet around us, you might be wondering what became of the Thatcher family in the town of Sagebrush Cross. Well, I'll tell you, the school that Maribel reopened became the pride of the county, sending more young people to college than any other rural school in the territory. Scarlett grew up to become a teacher herself, carrying on her stepmother's legacy of bringing learning to frontier communities.
Daniel's forge prospered, and he became known throughout the region not just for his metalwork, but for his leadership during crises. The mill that the community rebuilt together became a symbol of what people could accomplish when they worked toward common goals.
And Daniel and Maribel, they renewed their marriage vows on their 5th anniversary, this time in a ceremony filled with flowers and music and the laughter of friends who had become family. They had 3 children of their own and raised them alongside Scarlett in a house that was always full of books and laughter and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. But the real legacy of their story isn't in the buildings they helped construct or the children they taught or even the love they found in each other. It's in the lesson they left for all of us about what it means to build something lasting. You see, love, real, enduring love, isn't just about passion and romance, though those have their place. It's about showing up. It's about doing the work day after day. Even when the work is hard and the rewards aren't immediately apparent, it's about choosing to see the best in someone even when they're not at their best, and about building something together that's stronger than what either person could create alone. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the ones that begin with lightning strikes and grand gestures. Sometimes they're the ones that begin with practical needs and careful respect and grow into something beautiful through the simple act of 2 people choosing each other over and over again through seasons of hardship and seasons of plenty. The fire's almost out now, friend, and the stars are bright overhead. But before you head off to your own bed, think about the people in your life, the ones you work with, live with, love with. Think about the daily choices you make to show up for them, to build something together, to turn practical partnership into something that resembles grace. Because that's what Maribel and Daniel learned in that little frontier town, and it's what all of us can learn if we pay attention. The most extraordinary love often grows in the most ordinary soil, tended by the most ordinary virtues of patience, kindness, and the willingness to keep choosing each other when the choosing isn't easy. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we discover that what we thought was just a practical arrangement was actually the beginning of the greatest adventure of our lives.